Does studying economics tend to make people more selfish?
Maybe self-interest is not necessarily greedy. Self-interest is not necessarily selfish in the sense of not caring about other people. That maybe by maximizing my self-interest, I'm actually doing things okay for the rest of the world.
Some places have laws that say in the wake of a natural disaster, like a hurricane or a typhoon or an earthquake, vendors may not increase the price of basic supplies, such as bottled water, batteries, flashlights, gasoline for people's cars. Now, there are disagreements about whether these laws are a good idea. What do you think about anti-price gouging laws? Should shop owners be free to raise prices in the aftermath of a hurricane for bottled water, let's say? Or should the law prevent that? Alex?
Price gouging laws are a type of robbery in a way. Because
Robbery?
If I'm a shop owner and I can sell a bottle of water for $30 and that's where supply and demand match,
right.
Why should I be forced to sell it for $3?
Emily?
If you prevent a store owner from raising the price in a time when demand has skyrocketed, then you're not allowing the market to reach the new equilibrium.
And the reason you don't want to force them to keep it at the low price is what exactly? Is it because you agree with Alex that you're robbing the shop owner of the increased profit to which he or she is otherwise entitled?
I wouldn't say robbery. I would say that if you prevent the shop owner from taking advantage of this market opportunity, then you're sort of restricting their ability to maximize his profit.
And there it's a matter of life and death. And then there's a further, the economist argument, the person who's willing to pay for it. Well, the person who's willing to pay the most is the richest. And so are we at that point saying, the person who deserves to live is the richest person. And the other guys don't have the money, so rather than dividing the water among everybody, and let's say everybody could live, that one guy says, well, I happen to really like not feeling even a little bit thirsty. Right. I think most of us would say that's immoral. Mm-hmm. That we are, at that point, allocating the right to live by the price system.
So when they have these price gouging laws, as some states do, that say you can't raise prices of water or gasoline or of hotel rooms in the wake of a natural disaster, is that something that you would be in favor of, anti-price gouging laws?
Yes. We're asking, should we be subject the right to live to the market mechanism? I feel very strongly we should not. I think there's some economists who probably say, oh no, don't interfere with the market.
Right.
But
you're happy to, in this case.
In that case, clearly.
That's a mistake. Because I think what it does is it ends up giving the goods to people who are lucky enough to show up early at the store before the store runs out. Whereas if the price rose to equilibrate supply and demand, the people who showed up early might buy some, but they'd also be incentivized to conserve.
So if a gallon of bottled water costs $2 normally, and after the hurricane knocks out all the safe water supply, it goes up to $50 a gallon or $100 a gallon. That's not morally objectionable?
You really need a very big incentive for people to come in and bring in bottled water. So you want the guy in the neighboring state to get in his car immediately, fill it up with bottled water from his tap, and drive to wherever the hurricane is. $50 would do that. Whereas forcing people to stay at $2, you're just gonna have a lot of very, very thirsty people.
Do you think it's a mark of bad character that the shop owner is taking advantage of the desperation of the customers when he puts the price of a $2 bottle of water to $50 or $100? Isn't that being greedy?
Well, I think it's being self-interested. I don't like the term greedy. Economists usually use the term self-interested, and we assume that most people are self-interested in their behavior.
Do you think there's no difference between self-interest and greed?
Maybe greed is self-interest when it leads you to do morally repugnant things.
In the shopkeeper pursuing his self-interest by charging $50 or $100 for the water, isn't that morally disreputable, even if practically efficient?
This is behavior that's going to be better for this society because more water will come in, there'll be less thirsty people. If it's socially desirable, it's hard for me to call it morally repugnant. Once I realize it's socially desirable, the first impulse of thinking it's morally repugnant has to be questioned.
We do make an agreement that self-interest does exist in a lot of parts of a market society, but we don't necessarily have to allow that to infect everything. It's true, I understand the point of trying to be logical about markets, but I mean, what we're really saying is that, if a poor single mother comes into a store that's open during a natural disaster and says, I just need a couple of bottles of water before we can get out of here,
which is self-interest.
that's survival.
All that is looking out for yourself as a person who requires a
But
good.
is there not some more important essence of supplying your own kids as opposed to charging $50 for that bottle of water and putting that profit straight into a yacht?
One of the arguments for letting the market govern the allocation of water after a natural disaster is the efficiency argument, that it will provide an incentive for distant suppliers to undertake costs, to ship in more water, and that'll make even those who are suffering better off. Then there's another argument, questions of fairness, of what's right. There's a worry about fairness to those who can't afford to pay the inflated price for what is, after all, a basic necessity. And there's another argument about fairness on the other side, which is Alex's, that it's somehow unjust to prevent this shop owner from making as much money as the demand will permit. Let me ask you, Alex, why is it that the shop owner is morally entitled to whatever profit demand for water makes possible?
Well, I believe it's for a very simple reason. You're entitled to the fruits of your labor. If you can make more fruits from your labor,
But wait
you're
a
entitled
minute.
to them.
Why isn't it just a matter of good luck that suddenly the shop has a big supply of water and there was a hurricane?
Even if it's a matter of good luck, why is someone else entitled to expropriate my profits from this? Why wouldn't someone else be entitled to taking all the money that, for example, Mark Zuckerberg makes? Because it's also luck. He was lucky to come up with the idea to make Facebook. And
let's focus on the demand that suddenly spiked for water because of the hurricane. Demand is a fickle thing, isn't it?
it is.
And the demand for my product or yours or the shopkeeper, that's not our doing, is it?
It is not.
If the demand for what I do or you do happens to spike due to an act of nature or an act of God, why am I entitled to reap the benefits that go with that? To me, good luck.
Because you're lucky. Because it happens that you're the person who's lucky and reaps the fruits of those benefits.
Okay, Matthew.
I guess I'll challenge the assumption that we're basing our argument against the laws on an entitlement to profits. To enforce and intervene and set the price at a lower level would be to impose a social obligation to market institutions, which aren't their purpose. Their purpose is to be selfish and to obtain the prices that the market will get them.
And when you say that the purpose of markets is to be or to register selfishness,
Yeah,
why is that the purpose of markets?
because that's the most economically efficient way to allocate goods.
Why does efficiency matter?
Because it's about how people receive goods and transact, and in the long run, that increases productivity.
So it is a utilitarian argument. In the long run, it maximizes productivity and therefore, presumably, the general welfare.
Right.
And that's the case fundamentally for markets and for letting markets proceed unimpeded.
Well, you can't just randomly impose an obligation to society in markets when it didn't exist before, just because an emergency happened.
Nicole?
Well, you don't want to impose a social obligation. Well, imposing selfishness as an obligation is the same thing, saying that profit is good, that's the goal. Like you're still imposing a goal on a business. You're assuming that is their goal, and it doesn't necessarily have to be that way. And also, it's only efficient in the sense that you think that this system is actually allocating the greatest amount to the greatest number. And what if that's not actually the natural order of things?
You're saying that it's designed to be selfish, but at the same time you're saying it's designed to be selfish because it provides a social function. So we're saying that the justification is a social function, and if the purpose is a social function, then aren't we willing to impose certain rules about how we curtail and move that social function?
But the social function that they agreed to when they entered the marketplace was to be selfish. It wasn't to assume responsibility for the rest of society.
But people do businesses for all sorts of reasons.
I'm just actually offended by the idea that anybody is bringing in even the notion of selfishness into markets. I don't think anyone who provides a service to someone, even though they put a price on it, to associate that with being selfish, the business owner is providing the water. I don't think that's selfish. The selfish thing would be if he were to hoard it himself and not give it away to anyone. I don't think that selfishness comes into any argument here. Just as I don't think that the shop owner is morally obliged to provide anything.
I kind of agree with Ryan. I think the word selfishness is morally charged, and that people generally have an interest to promote their own welfare. And I think that's kind of what we've been using the word selfish to mean in this conversation.
It seems callous to take advantage of people's needs and desires simply to make endless money.
Nicole, you've introduced another consideration about the morality of markets to do with the qualities of character, the virtues and vices that certain market behaviors reflect. When Mankiw made this provocative statement that the purpose of business is selfishness, I think what I understood was not that the purpose is selfishness, the purpose is to promote the general welfare by increasing productivity in the long run, something like that, and that catering to self-interest and allowing companies to cater to self-interest is a way of enabling them to serve that greater good. So is there a third consideration that catering to selfishness, even in the name of promoting the general welfare, reflects bad character? Kevin, that's your argument as well?
I agree. I think that it might be okay to accept selfishness in some areas, but maybe not in all.
In many places, there is a shortage of doctors, and long lines form to get doctors' appointments. There are hospitals in Beijing, for example, where the care is very good, but there aren't enough doctors to serve the vast numbers of people who come, many of them from rural areas where they don't have access to good medical care. So there are long queues in the hospitals, and every morning the appointment window opens. The cost of the doctor's appointment is very low, $2 or $3, but only a certain number of appointment tickets are sold, and then they run out. So people are sometimes waiting for days to be seen. And there are ticket scalpers, entrepreneurs, who hire people to stand in these lines to get the appointment ticket, and then to sell them at whatever price the market will bear to people toward the end of the line who very much want to see the doctor. Let's take a vote on this form of ticket scalping. How many find this one to be morally objectionable? And how many don't? Mankiw.
In the second case, you'd have an essential good that's critical to survival and security at stake. I guess the question is, should we allocate security and healthcare to those who have the most money? And I don't think that should be how it's allocated.
Well, so should it be based on waiting in a long line? Who got in the line first? That seems to be the alternative here.
I guess there are consequences to both, but the first one I found more objectionable.
People who need the appointment more are going to be willing to buy a ticket from somebody who has it, who doesn't feel they need it. Now, you're probably going to raise the question of what if the rich versus the poor, and that's absolutely right. And if we're worried about the distribution of income, we should probably use tools that deal with the distribution of income directly, say a progressive income tax system and transfer system. But for given the distribution of income, free trade in those appointments is going to lead to the most efficient allocation of resources, which means it's not going to lead to a situation where there are gains to trade that are unrealized.
So if you realize all the gains to trade, you allow people to buy and sell the vouchers for a doctor's appointment, then the people who wind up getting to see the doctor will be those who
value it the most, as measured by willingness to pay.
Which is different or the same as those who need it the most?
Need is kind of a strange word.
Medical need? The need to see a doctor?
I think in a lot of cases it's difficult. I mean, you have to define what need is. I mean, if need is something like, if I don't get it right now, I'm going to die immediately, I'd probably be willing to call that a need. I think there's very few things in life that are like that. I mean, even medical care, a lot of these things are like, oh, I could wait a little longer. I could see how I do just recuperating at home. I think need is a very squishy word in some ways.
A squishy word.
Squishy word, because what's the need, what's not a need? You know, and
it's subjective. You see it as being purely subjective.
When you have little kids, they come and say, I need a chocolate chip cookie.
Right.
You know they don't need a chocolate chip cookie. Almost every time where somebody needs something, it's really that they want something. And the want may have subjective or in more objective or scientific grounds, like in healthcare. But life is full of trade-offs, and rarely is something a need in the sense that if I don't have it, get it this second, I'm going to die.
In the other cases where, it's not a matter of life and death,
Right.
there's another element, which is how do we feel as a society? What does it do to our sense of social solidarity as a community? And there are certain things that are probably rightly viewed as an abuse of the market mechanism because of the effect they have of undermining the sense of community solidarity.
That's an abuse of the market mechanism, even though life itself is not at stake. Social solidarity is, and it may be corrosive of community.
Exactly. And that's something that's very important, actually important to most individuals. Something that may be individually rational
Right.
may not be societally beneficial.
Right.
And that's really the fundamental issue in economics, that Adam Smith's invisible hand, the notion is that individuals in the pursuit of the self-interest would lead, as if by an invisible hand, to the well-being of society. We know that that theorem is wrong.
What kinds of goods are appropriately allocated by markets, and what kinds of goods are not?
Well, the distinction that I made was between luxuries and absolute necessities, securing basic rights, and I would incorporate healthcare under basic rights.
Because it's a basic right, a basic necessity, a human necessity.
Yes.
And markets shouldn't govern access to those kinds of goods.
I feel like they should in part, but in this particular example with paid line standing, I think is an inappropriate extension of the market.
And so how should access to the doctor's appointments be allocated? Based on who showed up first in the line?
Well, most of us agreed earlier that time is a more equal identifier of necessity and cost, and I think that that is more appropriate here than financial means.
Queuing.
Yes.
And what if the person toward the head of the line is less severely ill than a person at the back of the line?
I am more okay with that because of what we established as time being the more equal.
I'd like to push back on that. I think that time in a lot of contexts could end up being more equal in terms of equalizing for ability to pay. But I think that both of these are bad ways of allocating medical resources. Maybe a more appropriate way could be to triage the people in line so that people with more urgent need would get seen first by doctors.
So urgency of medical need, you think, should be the principle of allocation here?
Yes.
That I agree with, but I just think that in this black or white example, like is paid line standing or K or not, I think that I would go with line.
So I would most likely agree with you in that queuing in this particular example is preferable to scalping, but I would also say that both of these are inefficient ways of allocating medical
So we have
resources.
three principles here, don't we? We've got money, paying, time, waiting in the queue, and third, need, urgency of medical need.
Or consequence. The consequences of someone who had a more urgent medical need not getting seen would be greater.
But in principle here, Erica, you think that the first doctor's appointment should go to the person who had the greatest medical need, not the person who could pay the most or who got there first.
Yes.
Josh?
I think time can reflect urgency. What if someone who's at the front of the line has a less dire medical condition than the person at the back of the line? Then the person at the back of the line, if his condition was so dire, should have waited even longer in line to be at the front.
How do you answer the objections that have been raised to ticket scalping doctor's appointments?
I answer it with time. If I really need a doctor, I'm going to sweat and bleed so that I can see the doctor. And I'll sacrifice other things in order to do it because I value it that much.
But you think that someone, an entrepreneur who hires people to wait in the line, to collect appointment tickets, and who then sells them to the highest bidder, you think that's okay?
I think that's completely fine because someone who is in a worse condition than someone else, if they don't work hard enough to get to the front of the line, that's unfortunately their problem.
They should have shown up earlier.
Yeah.
If they were that sick. Mm-hmm. Now wait, I just want to stick, I want to stick with the ticket scalping case, and I want to make sure I understand your position. Let's suppose there's one person who needs life-sustaining surgery immediately, and there's another person who's sort of halfway back in the line. And there's another person who has a bad cold, but who has a lot of money and is prepared to pay the ticket scalper's price. Is that fair?
I do agree that urgency should take precedent in that case.
In that kind of case. Does everybody agree with that?
I think we're laying the blame on the wrong people here. The line scalpers are arisen out of a market failure and a inefficient supply and demand, and that is because of other things. There must be a problem with the market itself, so that lines are forming in the first place. There must be a problem with the healthcare system in itself.
Yeah, there isn't enough supply.
But to engage with the example, let's say you're a paid line scalper and you sell an appointment ticket to somebody who's got a cough that's been there for like a week or two, and that person is about to go to the doctor and somebody with a gangrene arm shows up and says, I need to go. We know that the person with the ticket is doing something wrong.
I don't think he's doing anything wrong. You're blaming...
For the person with the ticket... No, I understand that it's a market failure. I do get that, and we should resolve it at the supply side. That being said, if the person takes advantage of that market failure to do this sort of thing, is that not morally objectionable?
I don't think that's morally objectionable.
It's not morally objectionable to look the guy in the arm with the gangrene arm and say, you don't get this ticket because I think
he's a natural manifestation of the market, and you cannot stop that.
If you are the person who has the ticket, you just bought the ticket, and somebody comes in with a gangrenous arm and says, please, can I go ahead of you? You're just going to hold up your ticket and say...
Okay, that's up to me.
But you were wrong if you hold on to it.
I would give it to him. Okay, sure, I would give it to him.
Yeah, because it's the right thing to do.
Okay, but he can't be coerced to do that. That's the point he's making.
And there is also,
and nobody is forcing him. But
there's also a very different story though. Like, imagine that there are two people. One has lived off the welfare state their whole life. He doesn't want to work, and he has all the time in the world. And then there is a person who works every day and doesn't have time. So the person who works every day is extremely sick, but the person who doesn't work at all is not sick, but just wants to go to the doctor. So that person goes there in the morning and doesn't have anything to do, and the person who's actually working and is extremely sick can pay, but cannot wait.
But that's an urgency concern. You're justifying it based on urgency. You're saying that it's fair because the person actually has an urgent need. Yeah. Well, so in a way, it validates the urgency concern.
Exactly.
So what I was going to say from that point on is that I do believe that ticket scalping is okay up to the point when it gets down to like an extremely urgent situation. And if it's like, if the right to life of someone is at stake.
You voted no for water.
Yeah,
when we were talking about
water,
you said I have no problem keeping people thirsty after the hurricanes, and I would charge them $40 a bottle. You said that
because you wouldn't die.
Lack water. You wouldn't die.
You would die.
You would die.
You wouldn't.
No, you're gonna try that.
You would die. I'm not saying that you wouldn't die, but I'm saying that I assume that no one is going to be left thirsty, like in that situation.
You can drink. I mean, you can just.
If you charge them $40, you will leave them thirsty.
If you get to the practicalities of the situation, you can drink water from the outside. You can drink water from the tap. You can drink water from so many different places.
In lots of areas, you could not reliably.
All right, but wait. I thought you were going to be more welcoming of what you see as a small concession by Alec.
That's true. That's true.
Why don't you instead say, Alex, welcome to team necessity.
But
welcome because now you're saying, or are you, that in the case of access to medical care, the proper basis of allocation should not be a market, but should be medical need?
It is medical need. If you have like a heart attack or if you had a stroke, it is like you are going to die if you don't get the appropriate medical treatment. I mean, your right to life is not protected at this point of time. So you do need access, whereas I don't find the situation with water is urgent, definitely. But if the situation with water turns into a medical emergency, then that's fine. Because if you're underhydrated, then you can be taken to hospital.
But I want to stick with ticket scalping for the doctor's appointment. The scenario we've imagined, where a wealthy guy with a head cold is able to buy the next appointment, and someone else who has an urgent medical need can't afford to pay the scalper's price. Would you say that's unfair?
I would say that it depends on the urgency, and I would say that if it's not up to the point where this person is going to die, I would say that it's a fair allocation of the medical service. Yeah.
I would say, of course, it's unfair. But it's unfair for reasons not brought upon by the ticket scalper. And I have a problem with people suggesting that we legislate morality onto people who are solving a market failure and solving a market failure that was not their fault.
But they're not solving it. It's still creating
for the situation, they are solving it. They are allocating healthcare efficiently through.
But you're saying efficiently is that the people who are able to pay are the ones who should get the medical care.
Yeah.
That's one definition of efficiency. Another definition of efficiency is by need.
I'm conceding that, is it unfair at the root cause? Yes, but the root cause was not brought upon by the people who we are legislating.
Well, you can say that about lots of different things. Like, just because a certain situation isn't your fault doesn't mean that you don't have a moral obligation to do something in that.
First.
So you wouldn't consider economics to have a moral teaching or a moral lesson?
No, I don't think so. I think by and large, it's a positive theory of how the world works. It tries to be as scientific as it can be, saying, if you do this, that will happen.
Does studying economics tend to make people more selfish?
There's some evidence about that. I'm skeptical about it, but I think that that's an interesting question. To what extent does the study of economics affect people's behavior? I know some people have suggested that. I'm dubious that it does. I think it provides you a way of thinking about the world. I certainly hope it doesn't make people more selfish.
But if it does, what would be the mechanism? Why might it?
Well, I think it might change your view of how the world works and maybe make you recognize that self-interest isn't so bad. One of Adam Smith's big insights is that a world governed by self-interest can, under certain conditions, that is competition, absence of externalities, lead to pretty good outcomes for society overall. Once you recognize that insight, you then say, maybe my looking after my self-interest isn't so bad. Self-interest is not necessarily greedy. Self-interest is not necessarily selfish in the sense of not caring about other people. That maybe by maximizing my self-interest, I'm actually doing things okay for the rest of the world.
Does economics rest on utilitarian assumptions?
There certainly is a utilitarian grounding of much of economic thinking. Economists tend to think of what we call utility functions, both at the individual level and at a societal level, and the objective of policy is to maximize utility. But defining what is in the utility function is quite subjective. What makes some people happy is quite different than what makes other people happy. And economics has evolved quite a bit in recent years to try and better understand what it is that makes people happy. And that's far more complicated than just raising people's incomes.
I want to ask a prior question about the idea of efficiency. Ryan, you said that the ticket scalper should not be blamed because the ticket scalper is actually solving a problem. What is the problem that the ticket scalper solves?
They solve the market inefficiency. That's the only problem they solve.
And
yes.
in what sense do they solve the market inefficiency?
They are simply there to allocate the goods according to the price mechanism. For all its faults, it is the best system that we have right now for allocating goods.
But the queue allocates the goods in one way. The price system allocates the goods in another way. So the goods are allocated both ways, though different people will get the doctor's appointment under the two scenarios. What makes the second more efficient than the first?
In some way, it is tracing it down to the need for the person. When one person pays money for something, both parties are better off as a result of that. Are there externalities that agree with it? Are there moral issues? Of course, but I'm trying to separate them. An example I don't like.
You touched on one thing on defensive prices, is that by using money as your way to allocate goods, you will allocate it to who needs it most. So I think the purpose of a healthcare system is to correct health issues as great as possible. And I think the greatest correction comes from those who need it most. I think there's a near perfect correlation between how urgent it is and how willing you are to wait, to sacrifice for it, to wait. Not to pay. I totally disagree with the thought that since I can pay more, I therefore need it more and therefore deserve the service.
Alex.
I completely disagree with this argument. I think that money and time are almost like the two sides of the same coin. And some people do have more time and other people have more money. So I'm not saying that one system is better, but I don't see how they're different. Especially like in a lot of cases, time is correlated with the amount of time people put into work. And if you have more free time because you don't work, why should you get it first?
So say my hourly wage is $2 an hour, yours is $100 per hour. We both have measles. Do you think that I, since my wage is less, would be more willing to spend additional time in line than you would be because your wage is higher?
No, I wouldn't, but at the same
time. So we would be equally willing to wait in line when we have equally urgent concerns. However, if there was a price that was put on it, you would be more willing to pay that price than I would be. So in that sense, if we're using a queue system, then we would almost perfectly correlate our willingness to wait in line with our urgency. Whereas if we're using a price system, our willingness to pay or our ability to pay would be staggeringly different.
Just now, we've been discussing different ways of allocating goods, and at least some people in the group think that whether markets are the appropriate way for allocating goods depends on the character of the good being allocated. Other people argue that the market is an efficient and desirable way of allocating goods, pretty much regardless of the kinds of goods that are being allocated. We've also found ourselves appealing to at least 3 different ways of allocating goods: by paying money, by waiting, lining up, standing in a queue, or, when we came to the hospital case, on the basis of need or urgent medical need. We've heard a few different arguments in favor of using markets to allocate scarce goods. One of them is an efficiency argument, which ultimately is an argument in the name of the general welfare, a utilitarian argument. A second argument we've heard in favor of markets is in the name of fairness and freedom, that people should be free to place whatever value they want on the goods being exchanged. And there's a third argument, which is the idea that allocating goods according to market principles rewards those who are worthy of reward for having worked hard. And we've also heard challenges to each of these 3 defenses of markets. Some have argued that efficiency, the appeal to utility, may not be everything. Others have questioned the use of markets in cases where it seems that market outcomes are unfair in the sense that those who are poor but equally needy of some essential good have less access to it. And then we also heard a third argument, the worry that in some settings, taking advantage, let's say, of a natural disaster, to follow demand and to take full advantage of people's necessity is a mark of bad character. It's greedy, it's selfish, and we shouldn't encourage this. So 3 principles: utility or efficiency, fairness or freedom of choice, and virtue, selfishness and greed. So there are some big principles lying behind the debate about the role of markets, lying behind the debates we've just had about the ethics of supply and demand.